jazz, you look at rock and roll, skiffle, hippie, glam, punk, new romantic, whatever the version, the iteration of subculture, it fundamentally has the same rules, which is this is mine, it's not yours. If you can understand it, I'm going to change it.
Yeah, which I guess kind of plays into that like theme of dismissal that kind of carries on, of like why glam was dismissed by punk and why punk was then dismissed by something else.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think that fundamentally, you can't do the same thing as your older siblings, whether it's brother or sister, whatever. You can't. You know, you have to have your own identity. That's the nature of humans.
Yeah, and that's the push in subcultures then.
Personally, I think.
Yeah.
That, yeah.
But I think like going back to this idea of like American versus British, like the standout kind of band of the New York scene is the Ramones, and the standout kind of band of the UK is kind of Sex Pistols.
Yeah, you say standout was the Ramones. I thought they were a bit rubbish. I saw them a couple of times, and they were a bit. It was a very different scene. You know, you can remember Polystyrene talks about going over to
Yeah, in
the
Army
States
Cliche, yeah.
right in the late 70s, and she found it to be very different, very much more violent or aggressive, let's say.
I suppose that's kind of reflected in like the Sid and Nancy film as well, and how Nancy was perceived and stuff.
Yeah, but then female figures are always undermined within such settings, aren't they? You know, Beatles fans hated Yoko, but
Yeah.
she didn't really have anything to do with what happened. The Sid and Nancy film is a spectacular disaster. It's a bit rubbish.
I guess that kind of leads me to my next point, because we've kind of had discussions about how in Sid and Nancy they whitewash polystyrene. And do you kind of think like the media representation or kind of how scenes are depicted now whitewashes them or creates an unrealistic kind of expectation of what they were like in a way?
Yeah, I mean, quite clearly around issues of gender and ethnicity, the reality is, at the time, we were in contact with, you know, a very strong female core within the movement, if I could call it that, and people from a whole range of backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, but that's not how it's represented. I mean, if you think about it, it took 40 years for Polystyrene's story to be told.
And the daughter had to approach it, didn't she?
Yeah, and in Sid and Nancy, as your example, she was misrepresented, literally whitewashed. There were reasons for that, but you know, it took a long time for the involvement of a whole range of people to be accepted and spoken about.
How did you, as you grew up, how did you see subcultures kind of forming around you?
You know, arguably all art is about transgression and replacement. So as age groups came through, they bring their own signature cultures. You know, you're not doing what was done 5 years ago, you're doing what was done now. Fundamentally, it could be argued that all subcultures have very common ground. They're about identity, they're about belonging, they're about expression, they're about rejection of other things. They're different in themselves, but fundamentally the same.
Yeah, I guess it's like a baseline, and I guess if we're looking at like punk and hippies, they share similarities with how independent press really like played a role in their development.
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain commonality between the two, but from a punk perspective, it was all about, you know, F the old hippies, shall we say. But, I mean, in a sense, there's a lot of comparable ground, but you wouldn't see that at the time.
No, it's something that you look back on.
Yeah, but I think then the way that subcultures are interpreted from a historical perspective is very different from how they are as they happen.
Yeah.
You know, in many ways, the history of, let's say for the sake of argument, New Romantics, the history that you might perceive would be very different from how it was perceived at the time and what was happening. Which bands are in, which bands are out, it's changed.
And I guess we've had conversations about like New Romantics kind of seeing themselves now as a widely political scene. But in terms of...
Well, if you call Thatcherite political, yeah.
I mean, it's political in all the wrong ways, isn't it, really? But it's... Their music doesn't really have political basis. I guess they were messing with gender norms, but in a way that they were dressing up as pirates.
Well, yeah, but I mean, not just pirates, but gender norms. I think probably in New Romanticism, gender norms was a big thing. They're kilt-wearing idiots. But it's difficult because at the time it was about style and not really. It was a wildly unpolitical scene. You know, my experience of it at the time was it was very unpolitical. The Kemp brothers, who used to live across the road from me from Spandau Ballet,
Yeah.
they were Thatcherites.
Yeah.
You know, and they were proudly that. I mean, look what happened to them. But you know, so how a seed is viewed at the time and how it's later viewed are maybe two entirely different things.
Do you think that maybe the lack of political engagement from New Romantics led to kind of the development of indie, which if we're looking at like music and it held a lot more of a strong political stance?
Everybody that I knew that was into one scene wasn't into the other, and the politics was very clearly part of it. You know, everyone I knew that was into indie was left wing, and they considered at the time Morrissey to be a great left wing hero.
Yeah.
But look at him now.
Well, yeah.
You know, it's a bit of a.
But I suppose that happens with a lot of them because Johnny Rotten went on to endorse Donald Trump and David Bowie's quoted as endorsing fascism.
But part of that is about the fact that they're contrary people. They want to be anti. At the time, Morrissey wanted to be, I mean, arguably, what do I know, but arguably Morrissey wanted to be anti, so he was anti-Thatcherite. Although at the time, for me personally, I just thought he was an idiot in a cardigan, because what he's later become, I think, was what he was then.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
You know what I mean? But, and Lydon as well, you know, the reality is that you could argue he just wants to be opposite. I don't know him, but you feel as if he just wants to be opposite. So if he's expected to be anti-establishment, he'll become establishment just to be contrary.
Do you think that's kind of also a pattern of subculture?
Yeah, I mean, those individuals, they can do what they want with their lives. It's they own themselves. But at the same time, they're sort of vessels for the hopes of a lot of people who follow them at the time, who value their identity and connect to it. But sometimes heroes turn out to be idiots. You know.
But I guess like another standout band for me from the indie is kind of Joy Division, which we've spoken about, is a reference to a pleasure camp in Nazi.
It has Nazi roots. That
Yeah.
and New Order, both as names, had Nazi roots.
But kind of that leads to the point of like, why do you think that subcultures in post-war Britain had used a lot of Nazi symbols?
Okay, well, that's slightly difficult because it could be, you know.
I guess in punk, like Vivienne Westwood has always said it's to shock, but.
Yeah, because a lot of the, you know, there's a imagery of on one of her tops there was the imagery of two men. At the time, that was shocking.
Yeah.
You know, and I think you could argue that they were using swastikas to shock, arguably, because they just want to shock the older generation. The problem is that you can't, to my values, you can't repurpose those symbols. You know, I'm not suggesting that New Order or Joy Division were in any way right-wing, but they sort of support right-wing positions through their use of that iconography.
Yeah.
You know, you can say that you can repurpose things, but whether you ever can, I don't really know.
That's a fair point, I guess.
Yeah, but you can use certain words in the lyrics of rap, but what does that mean to those rappers' parents?
Yeah.
Because those are insults that you see what I'm trying to say? Can you reclaim, can you repurpose? I'm not so sure, really.
So I guess like kind of thinking about like how you engage and how I engage in subculture, did you see a difference in how I engaged in subculture? Or was it very almost like reminiscent of what you were doing, I suppose?
Well, yes and no. I mean, there's a massive difference. There's an enormous difference because as each generation progresses, it does different things. I would argue that it could be said that subcultures are repetitive, not just in the sense that, okay, people wearing, you know, semi-goth stuff 20 years later or whatever that might be, but they have a repetitive purpose and a repetitive shape. You can go back to punk, glam, hippie, through jazz. You can go right back to Bach. You know, Bach is considered one of the great foundations of Western classical music.
Yeah.
Actually, he was just a pissed guy who used to get getting sacked for playing that weird music.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm not saying he was a youth subculture icon.
He was
but
the
it's
icon.
it's constant.
Yeah.
You know, the rebirth and redevelopment of youth subculture is constant. So I think you do it in a very different way, but the function of it in your life is similar because, you know, young people don't change that much. I think new media produces a lot of different ways of doing things, but arguably you're still talking about the same things.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. So my last question is, to wrap it up, and I'll answer it as well, is what is a standout album or song, I guess, from your teenage years? Because for me, it will probably be Bring Horizon Sub Eternal. I feel like that really hits in my emo heart as a teenager.
I remember your mother asking me if it was okay to buy you that if the lyrics were, you know, dangerous.
But what would be yours?
Well, this is where I become, I continue to be massively pretentious. For me, it would be the BBC Sound Effects Archive, which is a series of 30 or 40 albums of sound effects.
You were just too edgy to be a punk.
Well, you could say that. I couldn't possibly comment.
But anyway, thank you for coming.
Thank you.